Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar. Hot off the press, overview of updates and changes in the second edition of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual. We are very excited to have Gail Bowser here this afternoon presenting, sharing the updates that she has made.
I'm very excited to be able to share this new document with you. I came on to this project for the Illinois State Board of Education about a year ago, and we've been working hard to finish the updates for the second edition of the Illinois AT Guidance Manual, which was originally written by Brian Wojcik and Karen Douglas at the Seed Center, or monitored and developed by them. There were many people involved in the development of the initial edition, the first edition of this manual, and now we've had many more people involved in the second edition. So we're very excited to be able to offer it to you today. You do have a link in the chat box to the actual PDF document, and we will be sharing that link in each of the upcoming 4 webinars that we're going to be doing. If you're wondering how I got involved with this project, I work as an independent consultant. I used to be the State Director of Assistive Technology Services for the state of Oregon, and so I've had a lot of experience working at the state level and developing documents and guidance around the areas of assistive technology and also in Oregon related services. I act as an independent consultant now that I am technically retired. So when there was a need to have somebody finish up this project that Brian had started, the Department of Education and Infinitec contacted me, and I'm thrilled to have been a part of this project and conversation. So thank you all for joining us today. And I hope that we'll be able to answer lots of your questions and also find out what questions you still have so that we can include those in the next 3 webinars that we'll be doing. So the history of this project, that was in 2012, the first edition of the guidance manual was developed. In 2017 and 2018, Brian hosted quite a number of focus groups around the state of Illinois and tried to find out what was good about this first edition of the guide and what needed to be added or improved. We took that information and began to develop the second edition of the guide when Brian moved to a new job in another state. So that's how I got involved. We worked hard on the guide in the last year, and we've had a lot of input from ISBE and lots of questions from the field that we tried to address. However, we know that you will also have questions and concerns today that we may not be able to address in this overview webinar. Today's topic is an overview of the manual, all the things that are in it, particularly the new things and things that we felt were important to highlight and maybe a little bit different than what was in the other guide. To help us get ready for the next 3 webinars and to make sure that we address as many of your questions as possible, I would really like to encourage you to type any questions or concerns into the chat box. We've agreed that I will try and address those questions as they come in, or at least in groups as they come in. But we also would like to have your questions in the chat box so that we can have a record of them and use that record in the next 3 webinars that we'll be doing. So if we can't address your questions today, we will try and do it at a later date. Here's an overview of what's new in the guide. There are some new state statutes since the first edition of the guide. So we wanted to address those, and those are addressed in the first 2 or 3 chapters of the guide in terms of new rules for Illinois. So we'll be talking about those today, and we will address them at other times during the future webinars. We also, in the new guide, have made some distinctions between consideration, assessment, and evaluation that are probably new to many of you. And we believe a clarification of some information that was needed in the state of Illinois about how those 3 activities, consideration, assessment, and evaluation, are approached at the state level. We've added a transition chapter about transition for users of assistive technology. And we have updated chapter 10, which is a chapter about creating an infrastructure to support the use of assistive technology on a district-wide level. We also are excited about some of the appendices that were added in the guide, so we'll be talking about those just a little bit. And you now have a copy of the guide, so you should be able to review all of this information and follow along with me as we do this work together today. So let's get started. The first change that we wanted to really highlight in the guide was Public Act 100-0993, and that was passed in August of 2018. You all should be implementing this new rule at this point in time, but it is one that is unique to the state of Illinois. I have not seen another state that has a rule like this. And these are words that have come directly from the law itself. So what that law says is at a child's initial IEP meeting and at each annual review meeting, the child's IEP team shall provide the child's parent or guardian with a written notification that informs the parent or guardian that the IEP team is required to consider whether a child requires assistive technology for FAPE. The notification must also include a toll-free telephone number and internet address for the state's assistive technology program. That's a unique law for Illinois. I'm sure that there was a lot of advocacy for students with disabilities involved in the development of that law. ISBE has provided sample forms which include the wording that you should be using in your notification of conference form. So here's the sample wording, which is also included in the guide. The IEP team will discuss whether your child requires assistive technology to receive a free and appropriate public education, FAPE, and the Illinois State Board of Education Assistive Technology Program can be reached by calling this toll-free number. So there you have a sample statement that would be included in your conference notification form. And we've put the citations for all of the forms in the title of each slide so that you know where to find it. You can actually search the web with that number and it should pop right up for you. So I'm going to remind you that you have the option of typing questions into the chat box and wonder if there are any questions right now about that form change. That's almost 2 years old. So hopefully that's something you've instituted and your district is moving forward with.
Gail, we did have one question pop in. The question was, if we are having an annual review, is this separate option needed?
Yes, the law itself says at every IEP meeting, initial IEP, here, I can go back, it's on this slide. Initial IEP meeting and at each annual review meeting, the child's IEP team shall. So it is required at every IEP meeting unless you have interim IEP meetings.
And the participant also asked for clarification if AT is already part of the child's annual review discussion, correct?
This form needs to be sent to the parents every time you have an IEP meeting, because the IDEA requires that assistive technology be considered at every IEP meeting. So yes. Did I answer the right question?
You did, and we had one more quick request for a clarification. Is embedding the statement into the IEP form sufficient?
I'm not sure what that question means.
Diane, could you clarify a little bit of what you mean, please?
So I'm guessing, and what I want to say is that anytime you send a written notification form about an IEP meeting, it needs to say that. So I'm assuming that at every IEP meeting, there's some kind of written notification ahead of time that informs the parent or guardian that you're having a meeting. Erin, are you on here? We did have help from
Yes,
ISBA.
yes, I could see Erin chiming in with a few things. She had shared that no, it must be on the notification of conference.
Okay. Thank you. That was way clearer than what I was trying to say, but it is the same thing. So notification of conference every time you have an IEP meeting. Okay. Another important change since the last guide was Illinois' new rule about consideration of special factors. And I have to compliment Illinois on this one. I have not seen a requirement like this in any other state, and I really do get to work in quite a number of states in terms of providing state-level guidance about assistive technology. It's exciting to see this kind of requirement in your IEP because I think it calls attention to assistive technology in a reasonable but also ethical way. So consideration of special factors is a section of the IEP that every state and every IEP team must address during an IEP meeting. And in your consideration of special factors form, here are the words. Check the boxes to indicate if the student requires supplementary aids and services due to the following factors. So for any box checked yes, specify the special factors in the supplementary aids and services, accommodations and modifications section, which is farther down the page, and or in the linguistic and cultural accommodations section below. The difference here, the unique feature in your IEPs is that if you'll see that the first special factor is assistive technology, devices, and services, and the wording says, if yes, please specify the needed ATs, and if no, specify why AT is not needed to access space. I don't know about you, but if you're an assistive technology specialist, I suspect you may have had the conversation about these special factors. And the fact that in many places, what the IEP team does is just check one of these boxes, no assistive technology is not needed, and then they move on. And there's been no guarantee and no assurances that the IEP team actually had a good, solid conversation about the need for assistive technology. I think what this very simple change in your IEP does is to ensure that people do have a conversation about why a student might need assistive technology or why not, and then you are required to record it in the IEP form itself. We tried in the guide to provide a few examples of how things might be done, and this was one of the places where we really felt like we strongly needed examples. So these are words right out of the guide. If yes is checked, here's a justification or what you might write in that supplementary aids and services section of your particular student's IEP. So based on teacher observations, Sarah requires specially designed devices to access instruction. The following AT services and or devices will be provided, and then you list the specifics that Sarah will need. So we tried to provide you a model that was short enough to be appropriate for an IEP. We don't want a 15-page report at this point, but we did want it to be as clear as possible what might be included in that supplementary aids and services section. Here's the other example. If no is checked, some kind of thing you might say is, Sarah can complete the required instructional tasks and can access the school environment using standard classroom adaptations and the accommodations and modifications that are in place. Based on the student's present levels of academic and functional performance, Sarah does not need AT services to receive FAPE. We looked at example IEPs as we developed this section of the guide and created this example. And one of the things that some people were tending to put in was a simple statement that Sarah doesn't need this for FAPE. And we felt strongly, and the wording is in the guide, but we felt strongly that just putting Sarah doesn't need this assistive technology for FAPE was not sufficient information. So you're limited in the amount of space in your IEP form. We don't want you writing again a 15-page report about it. But we did feel like it was important to affirm that the reason Sarah doesn't need assistive technology is because she can complete the instructional tasks that she's required to do in her education placement. So we really wanted to make sure that the statement was sufficient to explain what was going on for Sarah and why the team determined that she did not need assistive technology. I'm hoping, Sam, that if there's any questions about that, you can share them with me. Otherwise, we're going to move on to consideration, evaluation, and assessment.
There aren't any questions at the time. You can move on, Gail.
Okay, great. Thank you. I have to say that consideration, evaluation, and assessment was the section and the areas that we had the most discussions about, where we had the most questions, and where we felt like there had been some confusion in the state of Illinois. At one point, somebody said to me, well, those three terms are used interchangeably. They all mean the same thing. And so we really tried to clarify in the guide how consideration, evaluation, and classroom assessment are different and how they are used in the legal IEP process that we all are bound to. So I want to take each one of these topics and review them briefly now. We will have a chance in the next webinar to address them in a little more depth, but we felt like this was some of the most important and newest information in the guide. So, consideration. Consideration is the process that occurs during an IEP meeting where an IEP team determines whether or not a student needs AT to receive FAPE and documents the decision within the student's IEP. IEP team members present all available data regarding the student. This is actually a breakdown of 2 or 3 sentences that are in the guide, and you can see I've mentioned the page number in the guide for every one of these citations. One of the things that was a big question was how big a process is consideration? And we really felt, the writing team really felt that in this aspect of assistive technology, consideration should be a reasonable part of an IEP meeting, but not dominate the entire meeting. We didn't think that doing an actual assessment during an IEP meeting was a very effective process. So we wanted to emphasize that the consideration process is a reasonably short process. I'm not going to say a number of minutes because I know that would get me in trouble. But a discussion where the team may determine that they have enough information or may have to do some other things. One of the things that we really wanted to emphasize in this consideration part was the part that's in italics there. So in certain situations, tools that may prove beneficial to a student are readily available in the student's educational environment. In much the same way that a teacher or service provider might introduce additional strategies or adjust interventions to facilitate a student's progress toward his IEP goals in the curriculum, these readily available tools may also be introduced. So we wanted to address that situation where a teacher is working with an individual student who has an IEP, and she says something like, oh, she's not able to read this textbook, but it also came on an electronic version for our classroom. So perhaps if we worked to have the electronic version read aloud to her in some kind of a read aloud accommodation, she might benefit from that, and it might be something that we'd want to include in her educational program. So teachers normally, and as a part of good teaching, try things in classrooms, and they try them all year and in between IEP meetings. So what we wanted to say in this consideration part is that data and information collected about a student's performance using a tool like that is collected and shared with the IEP team to inform the AT consideration process. Any information that you already have about a student and how well they're doing in making their educational goals should be brought to the IEP meeting and, if appropriate, considered during the consideration of special factors section of the IEP.
I'm sorry, is now a good time for a question?
Sure.
Okay, we did have one question that a participant wanted clarification. Can the data for consideration be documented on the plot page, or does it need to be on the accommodations page under the consideration section?
It needs to be on the consideration section, but the data itself would not be in the consideration section of the IEP unless you just wanted to include something like, you know, the teacher tried a Chromebook with speak out loud accommodations and the student's performance increased. You do it better than I just did it. But can you say again, the first part of that question was, does it need to be on what page?
On the PLAP, or the present levels of performance page?
Oh, PLAP. Yeah. Only if on the PLAP, you're only going to do it if the student is actually using it as part of their educational program at this point in time. So if you're thinking about considering a new assistive technology, then it wouldn't be in the PLAP because you haven't actually said the student needs it. So this is the consideration process. Now you might say, oh, this student's been using assistive technology for years, and that's adequate. That would be another response that you might put in the if yes kind of checkbox. So did that answer that? I'm going to assume it did.
Yes, I got confirmation that did. Thank you, Gail.
Okay, great. Sometimes during the course of the AT consideration process, an IEP team may say that a student might need AT, but we don't really know what that AT is. That's when things begin to move from a consideration process to some other activity, which might be assessment and might be evaluation. So may need AT, but needs to gather additional information about the potential AT and AT services that would provide the student with sufficient compensatory benefit to make reasonable progress in her educational program. When an IEP team embarks on the process of collecting targeted information, then they have begun an AT evaluation. The findings of the AT evaluation inform the consideration process that takes place during an IEP meeting. So one thing that can happen is somebody says, I think this student needs a screen reader. And nobody's tried a screen reader. Nobody may even be fully aware of what a screen reader is or what the definition of that is. And the team says, boy, we don't know. We need more information about this topic. When that happens, the team has to be aware that they're actually probably starting an evaluation process and that things may need to change a little bit. So that before we go into detail about that, let's talk about assessment a little bit more, and then we'll talk about evaluation, then we'll try and piece it all together here. An AT assessment is a tool used to gather information on a student's performance in relation to any AT services and devices. So are there AT services and devices that might help the student reach their educational goals? Like all good teaching practices, this can include integration of a variety of instructional practices. It might be review of the delivery of the instruction, a trial of different instructional practices, or a change in instructional methodologies. And any one of those things might include the use of assistive technology. So we're trying to take it back here to good instruction and then relate assistive technology to that. An assistive technology assessment could include ongoing assessment of student performance in relation to AT needs, review of AT instructional supports, or the need for specialized instruction using an AT device. An AT assessment may be conducted by those instructional staff that work with the student more often and are those people who are most appropriate to assess the student's skills. So when we're talking about assessments, we're talking about ongoing trials, ongoing adjustments to the educational program, and trying to tease out on a day-to-day basis how to improve the instruction for an individual child. Evaluation is different. An AT evaluation is the process by which an IEP team collects information to determine a student's individual needs for AT and AT services. A request for an AT evaluation may be initiated by any member of the IEP team, and an evaluation might be conducted by members of the IEP team if they have enough knowledge and skills to do that and know enough about the student and the AT services that could be beneficial to the student. Does not have to be conducted by a specialist. So that's a judgment call. And sometimes for IEP teams, that can be a difficult judgment call. But the goal here is that the IEP team take a look at what they know, the aggregate bunch of skills and information that they have about assistive technology and the particular issues experienced by the child that they are considering assistive technology for. So you might say, well, we don't know enough about screen readers, so we need to call in somebody, a specialist who does know about screen readers. But you might also say, you know, we've never considered assistive technology of any kind for this student, and we really need to do an evaluation that identifies what we know about the student, what we know about the classroom environment and curriculum, what we know about the tasks the student needs to be able to accomplish, and then determine what assistive technology might be beneficial. So this is more than just a trying it out kind of activity. This is an activity that really frames a question and then tries to address that question in whatever way the team decides it should be done. You could have a specialist. One thing teams often do is we say, we need a specialist for this one. We don't know enough. That's particularly true for students with complicated disabilities. The caveat here, and the important thing to know, is that when an IEP team finds out that an AT evaluation is necessary, they say, we don't know enough and we need to collect more data and information because somebody's raised a question during the AT consideration discussion during an IEP meeting. If the team says we don't have enough information to make a decision about consideration, then the team should suspend that part of the IEP conversation until an AT evaluation is completed. If you say we need to do an evaluation, then you need to take the actions that are appropriate for your team to start any kind of evaluation in your district. But suspending the IEP process about AT doesn't absolve the team from meeting the legal timelines noted in the law. AT evaluation is an evaluation process at this point, and procedural safeguards and legal timelines apply. So I'm thinking that there may be some questions. I've got one more slide about evaluation, and then we'll move on to questions and some other topics. Here's wording right out of the guide again. Should a team decide to evaluate AT tools and services as part of an evaluation domain area? So you open a domain because the student has difficulty reading text, and then the IEP team must obtain parental consent, abide by procedural timelines. They may also want to consider conducting a formal reevaluation for students to obtain substantive data for the consideration of AT tools and services. So all of our decisions about assistive technology come down to consideration, but we may be trying things informally in a classroom setting and bringing that data and information to the consideration discussion during an IEP meeting, or we may be introducing a formal evaluation process when we decide that we don't have enough data and information to move forward. So, Dan, you got questions for me?
Oh, you bet I have questions for you, Gail. A couple yes, a couple clarifications from folks. So they just want to clarify. So ISB believes an assessment requires a domain meeting, or does only an evaluation require a domain meeting and parent consent?
As we define assessment, we are talking about aspects of the student's individualized instructional program that are already included. So you, I believe, would already have a domain open, and that would not be a domain evaluation, because you already know that the student experiences difficulty in reading text or speaking. We also should be talking about augmentative communication here. Assessment is how do we refine and improve the instructional program for the student. And when we see that assistive technology makes a significant difference in the way that the student is able to perform, then that's data that should be brought to the IEP meeting during the consideration section of the IEP. Evaluation starts at any point when the team decides that they don't have enough information and they need to do a formal evaluation. So that starts the legal process. How'd I do?
Okay, I'm looking. So those folks who had questions about opening domains, as well as that was a nice little clarification of assessment and evaluation in there. Did that answer your questions? If not, please provide any follow-up questions for Gail. Gail, there were also a couple questions regarding consideration that came in.
Yeah.
And one of them was, if you're wanting to consider something new, then it goes on the consideration page if you actually haven't tried it yet.
If you actually haven't tried it yet, you should never write it on the consideration page, on the special factors page. This is the opinion according to Gail, but I strongly feel like you shouldn't be writing things on the consideration page just because somebody brings them up in an IEP meeting. What you should be doing is either agreeing that you need further assessment or further evaluation, depending on the situation and whether or not there's already a goal for the student domain area.
Okay, and then another question, do you have to wait for the annual review to consider assistive technology? This comes from someone whose district is not one-to-one, so getting them something to try, we have to call a meeting.
There's two parts of that question. One is the district process, and the other one is, do you have to wait for a full year to have an IEP meeting? So any team member can ask for an IEP meeting that's an interim IEP, not the annual IEP. You may say, boy, this child just had surgery and she can't walk right now, and we need to change her whole educational program because of that. So, and you'd have an IEP meeting to change that program and decide what else needed to be done. Part of that might be the use of assistive technology. So whenever there's a major change in the student's performance, or when there's a need to change the student's educational program, you are free to have an IEP meeting. The district process, though, in terms of getting assistive technology for a student, is the district by district process. The team would have to decide the need for assistive technology. And then the district would need to address that through their own process.
Does any new AT presented within the course of teaching require a meeting for a domain or evaluation?
If you're going to include it on an IEP, it does require a meeting because that's a change of the IEP.
Okay, and then again, one of the participants wanted clarification. So assessment is if the need has to be determined, and evaluation is the needs are identified?
No, the opposite. I'm not clear that I'm understanding. Assessment is you've already identified a domain, an area where the student is having difficulty. You're doing specially designed instruction in that area, and you want to try something that might be assistive technology.
Okay.
Evaluation is we don't know if the child needs assistive technology or not, and we need to find out.
Okay, perfect. And would you put that further assessment or evaluation needed into consideration?
One of the things that your form does not have is a we don't know box. So where the guide words it, and you see the slide up here on the screen right now, if a team decides to evaluate AT tools and services as part of an evaluation domain area, the IEP team must obtain parental consent and then abide by the procedural timeline. That's a question that we need to ask the Board of ISBE about whether or not in that supplementary aids and services section, if you said, yes, we think assistive technology is needed, but we're going to do an evaluation. That's a state procedural question that I really am not able to answer right now, but it's a good one that we didn't really address, unless Erin has some feedback for us.
Okay, I don't see Erin popping in. I think she has actually she might have snuck out of the webinar. I hope I'm speaking correctly. Do you want to take one more question and then move on to make sure you could cover your content?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay, I'll take one more and then I'll hold some of the rest to the end. And the next question is, if a team invites a different professional, not normally involved in the student's planning, to discuss team concerns about needing AT, could that be considered assessment without going into an evaluation?
As long as it's not in the context of an IEP meeting. You know, that's another one I want to hold for ISBE. We're down to the fine details and questions that we didn't run across as we were building this guide. So I'd like to hold that one again, and I'll try and answer it. Our next webinar is about AT processes. So these are really good questions to include in the AT process webinar, and I will try and have answers for you by then, or we might be saying that's an individual child decision. I'm not sure what we will say. So I want to move on because I want to tell you some of the other new stuff that's in the guide. It's kind of exciting to me. One of my favorite topics in assistive technology is transition, and how do we deal with transition for students who use assistive technology, both the big T transitions of school to community and the, what I say are little T transitions of class to class or school to school transitions. In this chapter, we addressed these four main topics. We wanted to talk about what does high quality AT transition planning look like. We also needed to address some of the nitty-gritty factual stuff about device acquisition and transfer. So there are questions in this chapter like, if a student has assistive technology in one school district and moves to another school district, who does the technology belong to? Can the student take it with them? And we'll have a webinar also on the transition chapter itself. So we'll save some of those answers for that webinar. We also felt that it was important to address AT services during transition, because sometimes what happens is that teams who are helping a child move from one environment to another have believed that if they just sent the device with the student or help the student acquire their own device, that it would be used effectively in the new setting. And we know that that isn't true, or isn't always, and that students need training and to learn new skills in order to make effective transitions. IDEA defines transition as a coordinated set of activities that is designed to be within a results-oriented process based on the individual child's needs and includes instruction-related services, community experiences, and the development of employment and other post-school living objectives. This is the wording from the transition section of IDEA. And one of the things that I think is important to know is that there's no wording about assistive technology in the transition section of IDEA. And also, one other thing that's important to say is that this is transition from school to community. This is not the little t transition of transition from school to school, although there's a great deal of benefit in looking at each of these three bullets as you think about transitions from school to school or classroom to classroom. The processes and strategies discussed in this chapter on transition, chapter 9, should apply to any type of transition for AT users at any age. That's what we believe, and if you find that that's not true in your case, we'd like to know about it so that we can expand on the ideas in the guide and make sure they are appropriate. Here are some of the questions that are addressed in this chapter. Can a student take school-provided AT to a new placement? Can AT be transferred to a student on graduation or to another placement to which the student is transitioning? So can the student take the device with them if they leave your program? What AT and AT service components are important to address during transition? Both the big T transition and the little t transition. So we've addressed each of these topics in way more detail than we're going to have today, and we'll be talking about them in our third webinar about the guide in a couple weeks. But we wanted you to know there is a transition section there. One of the big picture concepts that I was excited that we were able to include in this guide was when we were talking about teaching students what they need to know in order to benefit from AT during and after transitions, we had a chance to talk just a little bit about the kinds of skills that they might need to learn. So this is a paradigm originally from Janice Light that talks about the kinds of skills that kids need in order to be functional users of assistive technology. So how to operate the device, how to do the thing that you chose the device for. Janice Light's original paradigm here talked about linguistic skills because she was talking about people who use augmentative communication. In this manual and this guide, we talked about functional skills, so we could also include how to write a paragraph and sentence structure and things like that for students whose disabilities were more academically oriented. There are social skills and self-determination skills that we were able to talk about in terms of helping students make transitions, and also strategic skills. And strategic skills are the skills that you need in order to decide when to use your assistive technology and how to use it, which device to use if you have multiple devices. So that's also in that transition chapter. You have a copy of the guide now, so if this is a topic that you really need to think about right now, that information is available to you, and we'll be talking about it more at a later date. There's also a chapter that was updated. Chapter 10 has become a chapter called Creating an Infrastructure that Supports Effective AT Services. And what we talk about in terms of effective AT services are really, again, 4 aspects of creating good services that everybody in the district understands. So we talk about the use of leadership and vision in order to create a way of thinking about your assistive technology services that everyone in the district and everybody who works with students who have disabilities and use assistive technology will understand. We also talked about management of assistive technology, the day-to-day operations, the checking out of assistive technology to your students, the inventory systems that you use, and the purchasing. But money is part of management. There's also a section on supervision and professional development and how that applies to assistive technology infrastructure and district-wide services. And then we talked some about proactive planning and the ways that you can take a look at what you're doing now and develop ideas about how to do it better in the future. So that's the rest of the manual in a very short nutshell. The appendices are also exciting in this guide because we were able to put in the quality indicators for assistive technology services, both the K-12 indicators from the QUIET Consortium and also the QUIET indicators for students with Section 504 plans to help clarify the role of assistive technology for students who don't have IEPs but do need or do have disabilities and need assistive technology to help overcome barriers. There are a few forms that were included in the guide because we felt like they were essential to the understanding of the AT processes that we discussed. So Joy Zabala has shared with us and allowed her to use one of her set scaffolds in that guide. There's a sample assistive technology implementation plan that was developed by the SEAT Center originally and modified recently for this new edition. There's a sample agreement between parent and district for the use of privately owned equipment. If a parent purchases assistive technology, often a communication device for their child, and it's sent to school as part of the educational program, there's some language about that. And also a QUIET transition planning worksheet that is included in the guide. We are ready and excited to tell everybody about what we've done and how we've created the guide, and we're looking for feedback and ideas about what kinds of things you need to know and how you, the clarification kinds of questions that you asked today. So we'll be doing a lot of dissemination about the guide. You are the first people that we've handed a finished copy to. So thank you for joining us today for that. Again, I want to encourage you to go ahead and type your questions and concerns in the chat box. We're running out of time, so we'll see if we can take a couple more. But we will be looking at those questions carefully as we get ready for the next 3 webinars. The one next week will be about AT processes, so we'll deal more with consideration and assessment, but also I want to talk about implementation and performance monitoring. The May 11th webinar will be other new content in the guidance manuals. We'll focus on the transition chapter and other new content within some of the process documents. And then finally, on May 18th, we'll be talking about district level processes and creating an infrastructure. These are people that you can address your questions and concerns to. But have we got any more questions in the chat box now that we want to talk about?
We do, Gail. I'm going to start going through it and I'll ask a few more. Here's more of a clarification requested from a participant. So assessment is more of a dynamic process continued through work on IEP goals versus a formal evaluation to identify deficits and/or tools or how to modify goals to make them achievable. But neither would be listed in consideration until after the process is complete.
Yes, you do not want to write in the consideration section that assistive technology is needed if you don't have enough information to say that. So I think you want to be careful about that. Assessment information can be brought to the IEP meeting and included in the consideration discussion. And the team may have enough information to make a decision based on that assessment information. But it would need to include performance data. The student misspells 25 words in a paragraph without a spell checker and misspells no words in a paragraph with a spell checker. That's clear indication that assistive technology is a benefit. So the team might be able to make a decision.
We have another question regarding transition. If
Okay.
you're planning on a transition for a student, do we need to evaluate and assess if there are new domains that would be helpful for the new setting? Or does the new building reassess the student's possible needs?
At some level, that's a district process, and how you handle your transitions for all your other students. But I will say that the sending classroom, the classroom where the student is currently placed, needs to provide a fair amount of information about what the assistive technology the student is using. So this is an assumption that the student is using assistive technology already. And it would be of great benefit to the student to include the assistive technology they use in the transition planning process to find out whether or not it's going to be useful in the new setting. So I don't want to mandate district policy, but I do think that that's a process that needs to begin at least before the student makes the transition. Because otherwise they're without their assistive technology while the receiving agency or district figures out what to do with them. That's a matter of best practice. It's not a matter of policy, and that's the only reason I'm hesitating here. So we'll save that question and send it back to ISBE 2.
Okay, and I have one more question that I'm going to go through and address. Does this information also apply in the private school setting?
You know, there's a section in the guide about private school settings. It depends on who placed the student in the private school setting. So this information applies to students who are placed by the district in whatever placement they choose. If it's a private school setting, then it would apply. We will address that in a future webinar. There is a section in the guide about whose responsibility assistive technology is. Depends on the student's placement. But I'd like to defer that until next time because we really are out of time, and I want to make sure I'm saying it accurately for Illinois. It's different in different states.
Okay, thank you, Gail. Did you have any additional pieces of information or things you wanted to share with the participants?
No, not today. You have the guide. It's available at the link that you were provided. And I hope that you join us again next time. You've given me lots to think about between now and Monday.
Thank all of you, and Gail, thanks once again. Everyone have a good night, and this concludes the webinar.